Welcome everyone again. Welcome to the new session of Software World with Can Dost. And this is a show in which I invite people to talk about different topics in software industry. And I'm Can Dost, your host. And today we will talk about startup marketing, strategy, and its challenges, and all the things related to startups. And we will focus on how startups should approach marketing and how they can overcome the obstacles. So my guest today is Peri. Peri is a friend of mine, and she is the president of Sipsetter and co-founder of Kadastar Ventures. And she has an extensive background in marketing and management and strategy. After graduating from Duke University and getting an MBA from Harvard Business School, she was the consultant and the marketing director of different companies, including McKinsey. So without further ado, welcome, Peri. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to the show as well. And so let's get this started. So I have some questions, and since we will talk about marketing and strategy, and I want to directly go into the point and ask, since the many startups are facing the problems of the finding the right time to announce the startup, the launch time, and when you should start marketing, and how do you decide when is the right time for you? So marketing and launching, yeah.
Okay. Way to start with a hard question, but I'll try my best. Yes. So first of all, taking a step back, marketing can mean a lot of different things. So it can mean everything from PR, like press releases and reading about a startup in a newspaper or magazine. It can mean very data-driven user acquisition strategies. So working with ad agencies to buy and sell ads, to place content about your startup embedded in other sites or apps. It can be around branding. It can be like a whole bunch of things. So, how you think about what marketing is will depend a lot on both what stage the company is at, so what maturity level, as well as I think it's important to kind of get aligned with the CEO on what the vision is of marketing. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, the most important thing is your user base and who are you marketing to. So that can be, depending on the product, it could be B2B, business to business, or B2C, business to consumer. I was doing B2B to C for a while, so you can kind of get into a few different parameters there. So in terms of launch is an exciting thing. So there's very few opportunities for startups to really kind of go the press release route or try to get their names into papers and stuff like that. Usually a lot of it is like paid sponsorship. Like in the US, there's very famous Oprah Winfrey. If Oprah mentions your app, then it's #1 in the App Store. Yeah. Most of us can't get Oprah to support our app. So launch is actually a great time to start to spread the word about your product. So if it's an app or a website, then generally from a PR perspective, from a public relations perspective, what I do is basically go down the list of who are all the tech reporters that I can reach out to and let them know about this. Who are the people that cover the sector that might not be in tech that might be interested in? So like for a fintech website, let's say, you might want to reach out to both tech writers as well as to people who cover financial services more broadly. So a lot of this is cold pitching at first, so it's a little bit hard, but the ideal is that over time, as you kind of create more content and have more news, that you develop a relationship with those people. Now, putting that aside, if you talk about kind of user acquisition marketing and like directly trying to get people to your site, candidly, that's something I'm working on this week. So my startup is set to go live either end of this week or early next week. So this is literally, yeah, exactly. So this is one of the things that we're talking about. And in our case, it's a B2C product. So we are looking at doing kind of an aggressive advertising campaign That's going to be a mix of working with Google, working with Facebook, working with Instagram. Some of these are kind of advertisement based. Other places, they might be partnerships with other brands and influencers. But in short, as you think about the launch, I just think it's a great opportunity both to do the traditional types of marketing that you're going to do evergreen, this user acquisition, but also it's one of the rare points to use kind of public relations and use media if you can. So I would definitely not miss the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, so I'm at the same time trying to create a business, by the way. And so I'm thinking all the time that how should I approach to this, like the announcement and also reaching out, like the user acquisition, for example, is one of my main concerns, because it's really hard to guess or hard to find out how to reach those people, even though, like either user acquisition or maybe some other like partnerships and etc. Because most of the time I had the struggle of targeting the correct people, and it applies not only startups, also the like personal brands and like many different areas. And like I'm trying to find out how can I find this core user group. It's really hard, it's really tricky. And if you do online marketing, like with some ads and etc., it's getting harder as well, because you can be very specific and you can be really broad maybe. But how can we choose this, the target core user group? Like how can we find out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would suggest tackling that from two different angles. So from one is just making sure you have a clear sense, or at least a hypothesis of what you're going into. And I don't mean, what's the demographic of who you're trying to target, but I mean things like, what's the problem that you're actually solving, and where would people go to get solutions to that problem? So it sounds very simple, but a lot of times, especially during launch, we get caught up in like, here's the features and oh my God, we're able to get this into this version, but we're not always thinking about it from the user's point of view. So I would just kind of like put that reminder on. As it relates to finding the specific user groups that you work with, there's an amazing guy, digital marketer on my team right now, and he has a really interesting hypothesis on this. So he basically, he purports that there's a lot of testing and learning in marketing, and I think that's true too. You kind of start with a ring-fenced budget, and you try different channels, or you try different user personas, and then whatever works, you double down on it. So he basically looks for undervalued communities. So he'll look at Facebook, for example, and he'll create content. We'll get into content in a minute, because content means everything and nothing. But basically, the hypothesis is if you test your content with a ton of different audiences, and they can be large or small, but based on interest groups that you think they might be, ancillary interested in, that might not have anything to do with your product really, you can basically find pockets of communities that way. You can find the persona you're looking for that way. So let me give an example. So my old app was a catalog shopping app called CoffeeTable. So we were looking for primarily females, a lot of middle-aged, and people who shop in that time on their iPads. It was an iPad app. And so what we would do is we would go and test and learn. We would go to a ton of different Facebook communities. So it could be people interested in, I'm making this up, but like Mexican food. That's one example. I don't know. People interested, I love Mexican food. I don't know why I just thought of that. It's 10 a.m. here. But people interested in all sorts of different things. And basically he would test content about our product with these different groups. And what you start to find is, so you're targeting, let's say, women in middle age, but you're not sure necessarily what the interest group is. We went across a ton of different interest groups and saw little ones where things really stuck. So they were surprising sometimes. So we didn't realize that there was a whole community that was also interested in like a Midwestern football team, for example. There's a sense of, instead of going directly for people who say they like shopping, we started going after people whose interest groups, people who like shopping, who also had other big interest groups that then we could capitalize on. So it was kind of like a sideways way of getting into those people. If I just tried to market to people who like shopping, it's really expensive and it's really competitive. But if I find an undervalued community, like middle-aged women who like Mexican food, and it just happens to be that like 90% of them are also really into shopping, all of a sudden I found something pretty interesting there. So you test and learn with these different communities, and I say undervalued communities because they're, they might be niche segments or so. And what you can do then, once you find what works, then you can scale it up. So that's when you can either double down on the advertising budget, or you bring in an influencer who happens to target that community, or do something. But basically, what I would encourage as it comes to launch marketing is to kind of cast a very wide net, and just know that, especially in a V1, you're going to lose a lot of your users eventually, because you're going to be making so many product changes and so forth. But so I hate to think of them as disposable, but like a little bit they are. So don't get too emotional about it, and just kind of go and test a number of different communities, test your hypotheses, look at the data. I think a lot of people don't realize that how data-driven marketing is, or at least good marketing is. And we can talk more about analytics later. But I think that's kind of what I would do for launch marketing. So don't do the obvious necessarily search terms like shopping, let's say, or do just a little bit of that, and focus on what might be some other interest areas that are complementary to that. And that's how you get the most value for your dollar as you're marketing.
Yeah, okay, now I understand let's say I now understand in which target groups or maybe user groups that I can target to, but I still don't know how can I reach those groups. So like there are, of course, SEO, there are social media, and also like content, of course, maybe influencer or personal recommendations like word of mouth. And now I struggle how to find those people, like in the three, like in like 5 or 4 channels I just counted.
Yeah.
Like, how can I stick to maybe one? Maybe I spend all my money on let's say content,
Yep.
or how do I should I separate them? I really have no idea how should I go like the strategy.
And I'm going to be honest, it's not as it's not as clean, and like there's not an obvious answer to what you're saying. So it's so it makes sense that it's a question to grapple with. And the way that I think of it is, I tend to think of content as very related to marketing, like very intertwined. I think at some companies, especially big companies, they might keep them a little bit more separate. But when I say content, I mean stuff that you actually generate that's new. So that could be videos and like imagery assets. It could be blogs or think pieces. It could be
newsletters.
I'm making this up, but like recipes, newsletters, things like that. Just any type of content. You listed a few channels there. So like, the ones that we actually went through the same analysis of like, okay, so what channels should we go after? There's TikTok, which is huge, but we decided not to go after that because we had an age limit in our segment, and TikTok is generally skews younger. Yes. So you look at a little bit of demographics like that, and I don't think so. Basically, I would lay out, here's the 5 or 6 main channels. Here's maybe the 3 of them that are the most relevant for our user base, and my hunch is you'll have a pretty good sense of that. You'll know if you're a TikTok person or a Facebook person in terms of who your target user is. But I would say that it's not a matter of just picking one. It's taking a portfolio approach and doing a little bit in 2 or 3 channels. You can do them at the same time if you have a clear way of measuring it, or you can stagger them and sequence them if your analytics aren't up to snuff and you just want to test one at a time. But I would say it's not a matter of like which ones. The big ones, 80% of your answer is going to be Google, Facebook, and maybe Instagram, maybe that. I think SEO is table stakes. Everyone should just have tight SEO. I think you can't help but invest in being where you want to be, and invest in content that helps you maintain your positioning there. So that's why like writing and think pieces are so helpful.
Okay.
So I would also say, so from a channels perspective, it's pretty predictable, I would say, what you're looking at. In terms of what works in those channels, that's where it's a little bit more unpredictable. So that's where I kind of go to this notion of content is king. We learned in business school that cash is king, like you always need cash as a startup. That's also true. So cash is like the big king, but if there's a little king, it's content. And why is that? It's because there's studies that are done on this, and I'm not going to have the right data or numbers to tell you off the top of my head. But basically, the better content that you have, that you're presenting to users, and it's fine if it's in an advertising way, generally, the higher value of users that you get in return. So if you kind of unpack that, it means that if I'm a wine startup and I start creating food recipes for foods that go well, that pair well with wines, and I start sharing that on, let's say, food blogs or mommy blogs or these different places, and I've tested and I've learned those work, the people that come to my site through those channels, through that content, tend to spend more, tend to have higher retention, and tend to just, in that sense, be higher quality users. So it's an interesting thing. So if you compare that to just like a little banner ad in an app, you actually can see the difference in the quality of users that you get. So it's harder to do. It's harder to create that content versus creating a banner ad. But the trade-off that you get in return is you get these better users. So as it goes to your question of, I've got all these channels, what do I do? I think you mix the channels, but what the real question is, how are you mixing like content versus traditional advertising? If you can invest in content, then all of a sudden that opens up a lot more channels, and it gets you, I think, a higher quality cohort of users than you might find otherwise. I'd say it also depends a lot on resources. So we know as startups, we are all poor. Like I'm looking for funding as we speak. So I'm like, we're all making our own coffee and doing everything. So it is a constant trade-off of what's the best use of resources. How many users can I get if I put $1 into this marketing machine?
Yes,
and
I mean that was my next question actually, because the content most of the time time consuming. Like of course you can pay and generate the content from content writers and etc. But most of the time as a startup, you sit down, you write those content by yourself or get the money and pay someone else to do it. But social media side is most of the time spending money and less time consuming, I would say. After you create your social media accounts and etc., set up everything, then you do, of course you spend time, but not as much as content creation. And I also know that from social media, like I think 2 weeks ago or I don't remember when, Uber said, for example, they spent $150 million on online advertisement, and they stopped the $100 million, and they said they just reduced to $50 million. They didn't see any change. This freaks me out. Because like if I have a startup or if I have a small business, I want to invest on social media ads. And if Uber says $100 million just went to trash, I mean, I don't have $100 million to send it to trash. I just have maybe $1,000, it's like, that's all I have.
If you're lucky. Exactly. So that's a really interesting point. So a couple of things here. I have an example of someone who built a really successful marketing campaign with zero budget that I'll tell you about in a minute. But what Uber did is interesting. So Uber is an example, or Uber, I should say, since you're in Austria at the moment. So basically, is that if you think about the maturity of a company and a company life cycle, like I'm drawing a chart here that none of you can probably see, but you're either at the very early. Uber is so saturated. They are so mature as a company that at this point, they need to take a look at what their user acquisition hurdles are. Maybe if they thought that it's brand awareness and it's, just getting their name out to more people, then their strategy makes a ton of sense. What they found out by doing that strategy, though, is that no, people still see the advertisements, and they're just not, the people who are joining have joined, and the people who haven't have. So I think Uber got a very expensive lesson in terms of that channel and that approach is not working. If I were Uber, which I'm not, and I have friends who work there who are like brilliant, but like if I were a big company, then I would never lose sight of the startup way of scaling up a marketing budget, which is you do tests. If I were Uber, I would have run that as a test in like 1 or 2 cities instead of dumping $100 million in every city, for example, to see if it actually makes a difference. And what Uber probably found is there are certain people who aren't taking Uber because they have some concerns or that have not been addressed, or that they don't need the benefit that Uber provides. They have their own car and they're going to, whatever it is. So it's scary to hear Uber say that that's all like lost money. But in reality, I think it actually is a lesson in terms of where they are in their maturity cycle and what they should have been doing, which is maybe listening to those last folks that they're not able to attract and understanding them and understanding what's the hurdle to them, and having a much more targeted strategy, a cheaper and more targeted strategy at those segments, as opposed to kind of blanketing everyone with $100 million. Now, if you're us and you don't have $100 million, it's a lot harder. But I met this great marketer, and he was actually doing marketing for a sports federation. It was an up and coming sports federation based in the US, I believe. And he was able to, he had zero marketing budget. And they just said, here, create an Instagram account and, make this take off. And what he did is he actually created content. But what he did is he took people who were in that sports federation and he featured them like for free. So he basically said, everyone in this federation is a hero, is a star, come be a part of this federation. It's, it's a federation of heroes and all this stuff like that. And he literally would take a bus, go to where they had, a game or a match, interview people right after the match, like had his, using like, these types of, microphones and stuff like that, and just created stuff on his own. So he would do his own interviews, and that way he created his own content to bring to life who are the stars of this federation. And he actually spun that up into like a multi-million follower organization. And then he got all the marketing budget he asked for. But he was able to start with zero just because and make it successful because he found what's the right content, and people wanted to see a little bit of everyone, a little bit of themselves, I guess, in that federation. So it's a unique example, but I think it goes to tell you that actually when you have less resources, you have to get so creative, but you also have to be just really thoughtful on like who you want to go with. If Uber had a budget of $1 million, I can guarantee you they would have taken a different approach than if they had $100 million. If they had $1,000, they would have taken a different approach because they would be forced to think at it at that micro level. So yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, true. I mean, I understand, and all of the things are leading through to me at the moment to branding and also storytelling, because if you don't have any budget or anything, or if you have really less budget, then story is what you have. There is nothing else you have to share people, because you cannot convince people if you don't have a great story. If you don't have a great story, you cannot create even content, even if you don't have money and just time. So how to give this story right? I mean, personally, I'm still struggling to give my story. It's like, how can I tell that I am John Dost and I'm a person, and imagine this is as a startup or any small
Sure.
business. It's like, because most of the time in the company there are just a couple people are working in the startup, maybe 5, maybe less, and then there's really like you just had an idea and you start to create your startup, and then how to give the story. I mean, it's really hard for me to define what makes a story a good story, for example.
Yeah. I think like if we take the example of like John Dost's company, John Dost LLC or whatever, like that's a good example because the instinct is to say, I'm going to tell the story of John Dost. I was born here. I went to here. I did this. I'm here. Da da da. And that's a little bit the opposite of what you're supposed to do, because the story should come from a way that resonates with the users themselves. There should be a very simple context. There should be some type of conflict, like there's a problem that's introduced, and then there's a solution, and the solution is John Dost. So I think people have, especially on the like working with like developers and product teams, and I get really caught up in this. I want to like list all the features. Like if I'm John Dost, I want to list all the things that I've done. If I'm this app, I want to list, but there's this cool thing where you tap this and it does that. And none of that should feature into the story. The story should be, here's a situation you can all relate to. Here's the problem that we all face in that situation. And here's the solution. The solution is John Dost. That way people all of a sudden it's a memorable story. It's simple. And it will reinforce you as a brand and reinforce your benefit. You don't need to talk about all the features and the things like that. You'll get into that, once they're using the app and using the site. But in order to get that story, I think it's really 3 simple elements, and being able to tell that in a very concise way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm at the same time thinking my personal portfolio and my personal website, and I've been doing the exact opposite. I just listed down, I'm John Dost, I do this and I do this. Like, now I'm thinking I'm a bit ashamed, and at the same time, I'm struggling, as you can see. It's like, yeah. So I'm just thinking at this while listening to you, I'm saying, oh my God, it's like I need to go and change my story, change my website, and change my brand, and maybe do something else. Yeah, that's.
I think it's good. Well, I mean, hopefully it'll spawn some thinking for you and for others, but it's so human nature and instinct to be like, I want to tell you the story. Then we can get into Myers-Briggs stuff. If you're such and such a person, you want to get into very deep in the details. If you're such and such, you want to stay high level. But our instinct is to kind of relay a list of things, and that's not a story. It's words, so we often confuse it with a story, but it's not the story. A story is a situation, a problem, and a solution, and ideally you're the solution.
Wow, yeah. I'm mind blown at the moment. As I said, okay, I need to go and edit my website.
We can talk about it offline. No, you're great. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about a bit the software and marketing relationship. In the core, our DNA is the same: users. I mean, we are focusing on users, we are focusing on understanding them, we are focusing on solving them. Yet most of the time, let's say, we don't work really closely with marketing. Yeah. And I'm thinking the companies that I've worked in, and also the other people that work in different companies, marketing people and software development people are mostly separate in separate offices. They don't work really closely. Why? And I have some theories for why, for sure, but I want to hear from you. And also, how can we make this better, and why? Yeah, basically why.
Yeah, this is, I think, so critical, because at the end of the day, it's not just about 2 functions. It's not just about marketing and it's about the whole company and the whole company's DNA. So like you said, I'll just build on that. marketing is very user-centric. And I don't want to get into design thinking. There's other experts who can, share that much better than I do. But at the end of the day, we are wholly focused on the user, both getting the user in, keeping the user engaged, and then keeping that user to come back. If you look at a product team, for example, a lot of it is very similar. There's a lot of overlap in what you should be looking at, which is what's the user spending time in and this and that. I'll give an example. In one of my startups, I was new, and there have been 3 developers that were there and had built everything since it started. So, when I came in with an idea, it was immediately poo-pooed. It was kind of thrown away. And I was trying to struggle, and I realized it's because we weren't speaking the same language, because the same language we should be speaking is analytics and user data. And so I was able to say, hey guys, if this is a purchase funnel, like awareness, consideration, add to cart, checkout, we're losing people at this step. So let's take a look at what's going on in this step. And when I reframe the conversation from, we should change such and such, which is not constructive of me to say, and change it to, here's the analytics, what can we do together to make this work? All of a sudden, I became like a partner, a trusted partner to them, as opposed to being like this annoying, function that's like, what does she really do? She just writes press release. No, it's like, actually there's value here to be added. And that was like, it was a big breakthrough moment for us, and a little bit for the company. Like what we started to do after that actually is, we were a small startup. We were 12 people in one room. So we put up a screen with all of our KPIs and changed up and had a bunch of our user analytics kind of in one corner of it, so that everyone in the company could see it, so that we all felt responsible for that level of engagement with our users. So there is another world in which marketing and engineers work well together because of the user data, because so much of what we're doing is aligned, like you said. Maybe in terms of user acquisition is slightly different, but as you talk about user engagement and user retention, I mean, we're looking after the same things here. Ideally, the marketing team or the marketing person has some really good insights about who these users are that they can bring. So we know the classic saying, like, you're not your user necessarily. That's really hard to communicate, because we were working on a shopping app for middle-aged women, and our developers were these like really cool 20-year-old guys. And it's really hard to say, design for this woman who doesn't want the fancy, all the features. She wants one tap, purchase or something like that. So there's a few ways to do that. So one is data. Another aha moment that we had was, I had a round of user testing. I don't know if you've used usertesting.com, but it's a great tool. It's a great tool. It's basically, you are able to watch people use your app or use your site. So you can see where they get hung up, or you can see where they like go back again. And it's fascinating. So it's not as much as getting a survey of like 1,000 people, but I used it a lot for like A/B testing new features to see if it made a difference in people's behavior and stuff like that. That was also another point where marketing and our engineers kind of came together, because we were able to say, we were able to kind of point to the same stuff, or I was able to point to, look, everyone missed that one button. That's really important. What can we do to make it better? Or they would tell me, we're getting such and such types of users and we weren't aware of that. So it really became much more collaborative. Now, if you take a step back at how an entire organization is run, and a startup, even if it's 2 people, is an organization, you have to think about how do you make your teams a little bit more cross-functional in terms of their thinking, a little less siloed, because you don't have the luxury of siloing when you're in a startup. I mean, everyone is on top of each other and kind of has to be, because everyone's doing everything and the information is so fresh and fluid, and you're just trying to react. And so there's something there around being, I won't get into the whole thing about being agile, but there is something to be said for have, if we think about what can address things, doing daily stand-up, getting aligned, maybe sometimes having a marketer and an engineer on the same sprint for some reason, if it makes sense to. But I think it's really a company-wide thing, an organization-wide thing to have the user be at the heart of everything that's done, but B, also kind of like break down those silos. I mean, I also found, tell me if you think otherwise, getting along just as people and socially also helps a lot. I think marketing has a reputation of being in this ivory tower of kind of being like, we don't get our hands dirty, we're over here doing our thing. And I think that's a mistake. I've seen that made a lot. And I think the best, or at least the most effective marketers are those that are actually closest with the engineers so that they can get a sense of what people are working on, what's the rationale behind things. It's just, you learn so much. Marketers have so much to learn from engineers. And I think engineers in turn have a little bit to learn from marketers too. But the point is that it's got to be a collaborative thing as opposed to an us versus them.
I think the engineers have a lot of things, not a little, but a lot of things to learn from marketers, because as I said, it's the user is the core of both sides, and engineers most of the time miss the user point, which marketing most of the time generates these ideas and the understanding of the user with data. And we talked about data and KPIs, and I want to also talk on that part since I'm an engineer and I want to communicate with you properly.
Oh, gotcha. 1001. No, I'm just kidding.
So it's like we talked about the KPIs and then said that, okay, the data, it has to be based on data. And I'm just curious about how we define the success criteria like KPIs and what is important there, because when I'm thinking as an engineer, it's not really clear for me most of the time that I need to meet with, we as a company need to meet with our brand awareness, maybe it's like a KPI, or maybe we have some other KPIs. Like how we can define success, and maybe how we can make the company structure and culture suitable to that success.
Great question. I think it's really easy to dismiss KPIs as like, okay, it's a thing that like the CEO asked for or that we need to give to the investors, so let's look at them once a quarter and be done with it. If you're doing it right, you're looking and like breathing off of those KPIs. You're breathing with them, because there's nothing cooler than when you introduce something new, whether it's a new feature or a new version, or you just did a marketing campaign, whatever, and you see the numbers move. I mean, that's the coolest feeling, because then all of a sudden you're able to quantify what you've done. So I recognize I'm a huge nerd for saying that, but it's true. So if you think about KPIs, they're certainly going to vary by sector, an industry that you're in. It's going to vary a lot if it's B2B versus B2C. So I don't want to get into too prescriptive of, these are the KPIs. I'll give a few examples though. So working in like a retail e-commerce app or site, we were looking at a few different things, and all of them could be tied to a specific, like either owner or initiative of owners. So we were looking at new users, we were looking at user retention, we were looking at user engagement. So like either you can use a lot of different things for proxies, so like time on the site or number of clicks or something like that. And then we were looking at other things like ARPU, so that's average revenue per user. We were looking at LTV, lifetime value of a user, which is basically you take that ARPU and kind of divide it by the retention, and you get that. And so basically what you get from that picture is you get a sense of, okay, who are the new users that marketing? How are they engaging inside of the app? Are they spending money? Marketing and engineering. And then are they coming back? And that's like a little bit of everyone, right? Yeah. So you can have different ways of getting there. I'm literally in the process of designing this for my own company right now. So like we're playing with like, how many should we have? I actually think that you should have not too many that you lose sight of it. I think it should be kind of like a set amount of, whether it's half a dozen or a dozen, no more than that fits on like one simple screen, no more that's hard to measure. These should be really easy to measure things. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a bit related question on the chat and says, when should we involve marketing when we are building the product from scratch? So in this KPIs, for example, that's the question.
Oh, that's a good question. Whew. Okay, so when building the product, I don't want to overstep, because a bunch of designers are going to yell at me and say this is where design should come in. But there is something around user research.
That's okay, no worries.
I'm sure that'll be another episode of like designers and engineers.
Yeah.
But I would say to involve marketing as closely as possible. Think of marketing as your user research team, if anything. So both during, why was I responsible for doing like the user testing stuff, or for like doing surveys of potential users that we thought might have been the right segment? I mean, those aren't technically marketing. I'm not marketing to them, but these are all things that inform and give a sense of who is the target user and how do they behave. Yeah. Most importantly, what is the problem and that they're trying to solve, and what's their alternative other than you to solving that problem? So I would say to bring in marketing really early. That also has a few implications too. Like, I mean, just super tactically, like a lot of the stuff that marketing needs to do, so like a lot of the analytics and stuff, has an engineering component to it. And so the earlier you can get stuff like that baked in, obviously the better. Yeah, sure. But also marketing might not know what to look for. Marketing might be off if, the engineers are going in one direction, or are creating features or solving a problem that marketing is not aware of. Then all of a sudden you have two kind of different strands going on. So I would say to involve marketing early on, and both from an analytics perspective, but also from giving you a qualitative sense of who the user is and how that evolves over time.
That makes sense. I do think that it's a bit harder in the beginning, but I think like as early as possible makes more sense. And I think I struggled.
What do you think?
Sorry?
What do you think? How early should it be?
I do think
there's no right answer. I mean,
yeah, I know, but I do think that after MVP, or maybe right before releasing the MVP, so we can define the metrics better. Because I struggled before releasing product that we involved marketing. I think it was a bit late, and our app had some content in it, and we didn't involve marketing. We involved content creators directly, but I think we were not really aligned with marketing, and this also created problems in an analytics part as well.
Yeah.
So we had to rework all the analytics events and etc. to understand our users better, and it resulted in not in a good way. But I now understand that involving the marketing and maybe related other fields as early as possible in the process makes total sense. But I'm just not sure when. But I think right before releasing the MVP might be okay.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, definitely like at around the MVP time is when things get really exciting in terms of data and stuff like that. So I think that makes sense. I think marketers, like, it's very easy to like, for marketers to like blame engineers. Why didn't you bring me in? Why wasn't I involved in the copy of that? But I think marketers have a responsibility to, have a close enough working relationship with the engineers that the engineer realizes that that's something that they should be doing, so it's certainly not all on, one party's fault. This is why I go back to, there should be some commonality, ideally, through a working model, through the company's DNA of being this cross-functional, agile setup, but ideally just socially, like, have two people that can like get along and that understand each other, even if they're not best friends. That makes a huge world of difference in terms of, it actually is crazy to me how much of a difference it makes in terms of product and output if you have like collegiality in terms of working relationship between different functions. There's tons of examples I could share, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm like in software engineering side, I always say that the people always talk about what is experience and what is seniority and etc. How you can grow in the business as a person. How can you improve in your profession? And most of the time, I suggest talking with other professions because you need to be able to explain what's going on in the technical side to the people. And marketing is one perfect good example for it, because if engineers and marketing people work together, then this also involves, like, this also improves engineers personal growth. And I do think it applies for the marketing person as well.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think it's like a both growing at the same time is a really good strategy. And I do think involving early on is also applicable on that side.
And this is where the CEO, I mean, again, not to belabor this company DNA point, but I do think it's the most critical. The CEO has a responsibility here. Whether it's the founder or someone else, they need to set the stage for that being the expectations. If they're not already, they need to make sure that they have, cross-functional team meetings. They need to make sure that, basically different people are talking to each other. So I definitely think there's a responsibility there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I have some other topics, but I'm not sure if we have enough time, because I have so many questions I can ask, but there's of course not enough time always. But let me ask you one other question about user growth, because
Sure.
this is you start and you kickstart and everything goes on and you pick that strategy. And what I see most of the time, that startups and also maybe personal brands or small businesses, they struggle with user growth. They are either stuck in a really beginning step, saying that, okay, maybe they are addressing a niche market, or maybe that's a really small market, let's say. How they can approach user growth to break this chain, or because this is the step that most of the people are still struggling. I know it's not easy to answer in one aspect, of course. I mean, and it depends on many different things.
Exactly. All of that is true. Thank you for caveating it for me. I think the first thing to do is to talk to the user. So talk to your existing users right away. And you can do that through different ways. Like things like a survey is imperfect. Ideally, you would have a design-led like workshop or something like that. But immediately talk to your existing users to understand what it is that what benefits and what solutions they're using versus what they're not. What are their alternatives? Mm-hmm. Where are they spending their time? Just get a holistic picture of your existing user, because more often than not, that's going to indicate to you where to look in terms of how to improve user growth. The other thing I would do is do customer segmentation. So look at your users, who's most valuable and who's least valuable. So you can tell by looking at either the ARPU or the lifetime value, and just seeing if you're losing or if you're not growing bad users, that's not a bad thing necessarily. It might mean that you've improved a marketing channel and you're getting fewer users, but they're higher quality, for example. We ran into that a lot doing app marketing and mobile user acquisition. It was super easy. If I wanted to get like 10,000 new users today, I could do that. But I wanted to get the 100 right users that would actually come back. So I would do a segmentation as well, just to see who is at risk. And then I would also run analytics on like where in the funnel, again, where in that process funnel do you find any like step downs, to see if there's things like that can help kind of improve the retention of the users that you do have. In general, user growth is often, I mean, it's the critical metric for investors, especially.
Yeah.
Things like it depends if it's new user growth. If you're looking at churn, usually churn is just as equally an important metric. That actually was the metric that totally torpedoed one of my startups, which was we had great users coming in, but for some reason, none of them were coming back. And we didn't realize that because we were measuring it in one way, we realized we should have measured another. All of a sudden, we were like, oh, shoot, we're losing a bunch of people. And in that case, literally what we did is we did the segmentation. I did a survey of users and things like that. I would also say, not just talk to the user from a research perspective, but actively reach out to existing users. The number one reason for, I think, something like 80% of lack of retention among startups is poor service. So if you're also able to reach out and engage with customers, see what you can do better to help them and actually change your internal operations to reflect and address those makes a big difference. I think that more communication gets better. I was going to say output. That's not the right word, but gets more engagement from your users. So all of a sudden, I think the more communication that's done to existing users, maybe introduction of things like loyalty programs or referral programs are also a great way of getting high quality users, as I call it. But in general, if I go back to your Uber example, that's one where they probably have stagnating user growth.
Yeah.
And that's one where, again, I would ask people who do shop with them and people who don't, and talk to the ones who don't and see what they're doing and what's their alternative and try to address that as well. So it all comes back to talking to your existing users, communicating aggressively with those existing users, ensuring your operations are fit to provide the scale to those users, and then to non-users, actually do something pretty similar and find, instead of a blanket approach, find certain niches or segments or locations where you can really dive in.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I have like a better understanding overall, and I have so many other questions, but let's cut here. And I want to take the chance to maybe invite you again, so I can ask my remaining questions later on.
I would love to, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think the biggest thing here is, marketers and we're all people that are doing the same thing with the same goal. And it's really easy to dismiss one or the other, and say, oh, she's just a so-and-so, he's just a so-and-so. But like you said, Jandos, the people who are most effective, especially from an engineering perspective, are those that at least have awareness of and understanding of how what they're doing influences all the other functions. And that includes marketing. And I think the best part about a startup, I think, is the culture. And even if you're not the CEO or the founder, you have the ability to influence culture. And you can take it upon yourself to just go get coffee with marketer and see what it's like and ask what they're working on. I would do that. We did that all the time in our old startup. So I think there's something that, it's not that you don't have enough work to do. I know you do, beloved engineers. I know you do, but I think it'll enable you to do your work better. I think if you invest a little bit of time, and you'll get some returns, not just from your own work, but also you'll have marketing sharing their work with you, which can only help. So I'd say, just come at things from a place of empathy and shared goal.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah, and I agree totally. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot. I really enjoyed talking, and I'm pretty sure I will rewind this again and watch it or listen it later again and again many times. And again, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your spending time here. Yeah, and everyone, thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with us, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.